Hello and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Today, we'll be discussing human rights in relations to Israel and Palestine, including the killing of Shireen ACT. To offer his thoughts on this issue, we are joined by Omar Shakir. Omar serves as the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. Omar holds a JD from Stanford Law, an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs, and a BA in International Relations from Stanford University. Omar, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to begin, can you help our audience understand what we'll be discussing and why it is important to talk about our topic today?
I think it's important to discuss this topic because, especially in the U.S. context, when people talk about Israel-Palestine, you so often think of it as, these two warring peoples, a 1,000-year-old conflict between different religions, different groups of people, an intractable conflict over, a contested land. But in reality, and as somebody who's worked on human rights abuses in different contexts, from Egypt to Pakistan to the United States, the reality here is this is like other conflicts. It's a largely modern conflict about access to land, resources, and basic rights. And I think it's important to sort of take some of the language around the conflict, right? The myths, the idea of, that this is a temporary situation, that there's democratic Israel with an occupation, the idea that there's a peace process, the two equal parties here, and actually look at the reality on the ground. And Human Rights Watch, just as we work on nearly 100 countries around the world, did that in Israel-Palestine. We've been looking at how Israel treats Palestinians. We've been analyzing human rights issues for well over 3 decades. And, we believe it's critical, no matter what you believe is the right way forward on the ground, to have that assessment grounded in the facts on the ground. And that's why I think this conversation is so critical.
Thank you. And to follow up on your statement, what are those facts on the ground? What are the realities that we may have myths or not understand or have misconceptions about?
Yeah, I think that you have to start with the basic reality on the ground, which is that today, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, you have one government that primarily rules over this area. That's the Israeli government. And in this area, you have two groups of roughly equal size, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. And that government's policy has methodically been to privilege members of one group, Jewish Israelis, and systematically repress members of the other, Palestinians, to different degrees of intensity. Now, that simple sort of 4-sentence summation of the reality on the ground is often obscured or hidden behind talk of peace process and two-state solution and everything like that. So I think you have to understand that reality. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Harvard Law School's Human Rights Clinic, UN experts, Israeli and Palestinian rights groups have reached the conclusion that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid, which is a crime under international law. It's a crime against humanity, set out in international treaties. There's a consensus around that in the human rights movement. But I think understanding the underlying reality of structural repression, of structural violence, of a government privileging one people at the expense of another, and that the gravity amounts to apartheid. I think those are central. They're not the whole story. There's a lot more there. There are abuses committed by Palestinians. There is, historical nuances and complexities, but all of that shouldn't take away from the kind of this basic underlying reality.
Okay, and then could you define what you mean by apartheid? And for some of our audiences who may not know what that means, and can you also further detail what the systemic injustices are and look like for people who may not be immersed in what's going on in that region?
Sure. So obviously, when most people think apartheid, they think Southern Africa.
Right.
Not just South Africa, maybe elsewhere. But while the term was coined in relation to specific systems and practice that took place in Southern Africa, international treaties, including the International Covenant on the elimination of racial discrimination, define apartheid as a universal legal term, right? It is the term under international law for severe discriminatory oppression. And it's actually also a crime against humanity. So apartheid as a crime against humanity, like any crime, right? You have an act, you have a mental state, and then you have a context. With apartheid, basically, we're talking about what are known as inhumane acts, which are really severe abuses, in conjunction, with an intent to maintain a system of domination by one group of people over another. And then you need that to take place in a context of systematic oppression by the dominant group over the marginalized group. So inhumane acts, intent to dominate, and systematic oppression. In the context of Israel-Palestine, we found that the Israeli government has methodically sought to maintain a system of domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians, and in furtherance of that objective has carried out inhumane acts and systematic oppression against Palestinians. So our report looks in 200 plus pages, a report released last year, lays out the facts that led us to that conclusion. In very short summary, we found that Israeli policy is underlined by an intent to maintain, in essence, maximum land, minimum Palestinians. So seeking to maximize demographic Jewish majority, and also maximizing land for Jewish Israelis while confining Palestinians to smaller and smaller enclaves of land. And we look in our report at the ways in which this manifests in formal law and policy, but also in years-long practices and abuses. And then the report lays out some of the systematic oppression, right? The reality in the occupied Palestinian territory, where Israel militarily rules over the millions of Palestinians that live there, while Jewish Israelis living in the very same territory are governed under a civil law system, and the ways in which Israel expropriates land from Palestinians, gives them to Jewish Israelis living in illegal settlements, which are violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the ways in which resource discrimination takes place, and the abuses then of Palestinians that are committed against this context, from sweeping movement restrictions, demolitions of homes, denial of residency rights to Palestinians, civil rights deprivations. The list goes on and on and on, but that's sort of the short outline of what we lay out in great detail in different parts of Israeli-controlled land.
All right, and thank you so much for detailing that for us. Human Rights Watch is supposed to be a fair entity that simply documents abuses from all parties, right? So not just saying Israelis or Palestinians, but every stakeholder involved in all issues. How does Human Rights Watch ensures that the reports are bias-free? Because with the age of information, misinformation, and disinformation, some may assume or argue that the reports are biased or unfair towards Israelis. Is fairness ensured in the process?
Yeah, I mean, look, we cover 100 countries around the world. We cover every country in the Middle East, North Africa. And a core part of our methodology is we strictly adhere to international humanitarian human rights law. We don't take sides in conflicts. We're not making judgments about whether or not a war or an occupation is legitimate or illegitimate. We document abuses committed by all sides to a conflict. And of course, we're regularly accused by governments of being biased when they don't like the content of our findings. The Egyptian government has blocked Human Rights Watch in my entry based on the reporting we did about killings of protesters. I was blocked from entering Bahrain over years of Human Rights Watch's work regarding authoritarian rule, caging of dissidents in Bahrain. And similarly, of course, Israel has done the same thing with not being happy with the content of our reporting, but you can look at our website. You can see long reports about arbitrary arrest and torture by the Palestinian Authority, unlawful firing of rockets by Hamas authorities, numerous other abuses. This isn't about a false scale of parity, right? Because no conflict is like that. It's about reflecting the reality of human rights on the abuse on the ground. And I think our reporting attests to that. We also have a very rigorous methodology. We collect information from a wide variety of sources. We do interviews. We seek the perspectives of all parties to a conflict. We look at physical evidence. We have a very rigorous vetting and review process. And I think it's worth noting, and maybe I'll make this my final point to answer your question, is that the report we released, Finding Apartheid, was released in April of 2021, a year and a half ago. You can find much commentary about the report. I mean, hundreds or thousands of news articles. I challenge your listener and you to see if you can find one example of an article that disputes any of the facts that we documented or how we applied a lot of the facts. No, you won't find it. What you're going to find is what we call straw men, which is pretending we argued something else. Oh, Israel's not like South Africa. That's not what we argued. We were saying that they commit abuses that are meet a certain threshold for crime under international law, or to attack ad hominemly the organization or myself. And I think I encourage others to look at, and I know this is sort of what this program does, is to look at the facts, ask, and make your own decisions about the reality.
Thank you so much for that. In 2019, you were deported from Israel for your advocacy against settlements in the West Bank. Can you help us understand how and why this occurred? And what does it mean? What does it tell us about the situation?
So it's quite a long story. I would summarize it by saying that the Israeli government for years has sought to muzzle Human Rights Watch's reporting about its human rights abuses. It began initially with the Israeli government in 2017 denying authorization to Human Rights Watch to hire any foreign employee based on their assessment that Human Rights Watch was not a legitimate human rights group, that we were propagandists. When that story went public, they quickly backtracked. The organization got a work permit. I got a work visa. But pretty quickly, the efforts took different forms. So I was ultimately ordered deported in May of 2018. At that point, their argument shifted. They argued that we called for boycotts of Israel. They focused on my own background and experience from university as a student at Stanford, but all the way to my work at Human Rights Watch. We challenged that decision in court, both a law that, because it's based on an Israeli law that authorizes the Interior Ministry, actually instructs them to deny entry to supporters of boycotts of Israel. So we both challenged the legitimacy of such a law, but also, we made the point that Human Rights Watch actually doesn't call for boycotts. We document human rights abuse and call for respect for human rights. So we got an injunction, so I was able to stay in the country while we fought this out in the court system, and went all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court. And in November 2019, the Supreme Court upheld the deportation order, and I was forced to leave. I think you need to understand that decision in a context in which there's been a methodical targeting of human rights defenders. As we speak right now, Israel has criminalized 6 of Palestine's most prominent human rights organizations. They've raided their offices, issued closure orders against them. Their staff at any moment could be arrested. Israeli human rights advocates and defenders have also faced funding restrictions, attacks. They've been maligned and stigmatized. So there's quite a clear, methodical, systematic effort here to muzzle advocacy for Palestinian rights.
Thank you so much for putting that forth. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit. The U.S. is opening an investigation into, this is long overdue, but into the murder of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. And some members of Congress just introduced the Justice for Shireen Act. Can you give us your insight on her killing and the impact and gravity of it? And what does it mean for this investigation to be finally opened?
Absolutely. Shireen Abu Akleh was an incredibly well-respected journalist for the Al Jazeera network. I think it's difficult for Americans to understand how big of a person she was for many people, especially in the Middle East. She was the voice of Palestine for more than 2 decades. She reported every day the realities on the ground through conflict, through all sorts of different sort of iconic events. And, about 6 months ago, she was reporting on an Israeli army raid in Jenin in the northern West Bank, and she was gunned down by Israeli forces. Now, the Israeli government initially claimed, she was shot by Palestinian militants, but several major independent investigations from the UN, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the Associated Press, from Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, every single one of them, all the evidence has pointed to Israeli forces having gunned her down. And ultimately, the Israeli government itself acknowledged that she was likely killed by Israeli soldiers. The evidence has been very conclusive in that respect. But yet the Israeli government has said that it won't be taking any action against those who killed Shireen. And that's in fitting with a years-long practice of impunity for grave human rights abuses. So Shireen's family has been calling for the United States to open an investigation. And the United States finally, belatedly, and I think a lot of credit is due to the family for their advocacy, human rights groups, but also, of course, voices in Congress, which has led now to there being this investigation that was recently opened. Human Rights Watch calls for that investigation to ensure that it's thorough, that it looks not only at Shireen's killing, but the use of force standards, the larger context that has led to the regular killing of Palestinians, and that the investigation has an eye towards ensuring that perpetrators are ultimately held accountable for what took place.
As we come to an end, I want to give you the platform to offer your insight generally about our conversation, and to also maybe speak to those who may not view what's happening specifically in Palestine and Israel and across the region as human rights abuses.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, if you're listening to this program, you're somebody who's thinking about the world, that's researching it. I would encourage you to read the facts. Read our reporting on different situations. Read the reporting of others. Read the fact-based criticisms that have been lodged against our reports, and reach your own determination. I think there's too often, a desire to sort of be stuck in. Read it, because invariably when you read the news on Israel, Palestine, or anywhere really, you'll get a snapshot, and they're important, but not enough of reporting provides a deeper context. So I think it's important to understand those dimensions. And in our apartheid report, again, you can just Google Human Rights Watch, apartheid threshold cross was the report's name. We tried to provide some context. Now, I would encourage you to read that, but also to read other accounts from Israeli human rights groups, Palestinian human rights groups, and reach your own conclusions. I think the challenge that we have far too often is not only complacency in the knowledge we have, but then an unwillingness to speak out about the reality on the ground. But really, the first step, to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly, right? And so I encourage folks to make their own determination, their own judgment, and then to speak out, right? Because ultimately, the United States, when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and unfortunately much of the Middle East, is not a neutral bystander. We're deeply, deeply involved, billions of dollars in military aid, deep diplomatic security, and other support. So, those that are in the United States listening, your taxpayer dollars are going here. So you have an obligation to read more, to make your own determination, and ultimately to speak out. And our conclusion, based on the overwhelming evidence, based on 3+ decades of research, is that apartheid is the reality for millions of Palestinians, and that the sooner that is recognized, that's getting us one step closer to taking the sorts of measures in a situation that's this grave warrants, and ultimately to a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. A 55-year occupation is not temporary. A daily reality of structural oppression and violence is not a conflict between two equal parties. Millions of people deprived of their fundamental rights solely because of who they are is not merely an abusive occupation. Every day, a Palestinian is born in Gaza without the right to move freely, in the West Bank without basic civil rights, in Israel with an inferior legal status by law, and as refugees across the region without the right to return to the country where they're from, all because they're Palestinian. And that needs to end. That needs to end today. We all want a political solution. It's not coming. So let's stop thinking about solutions and let's focus on the problem and how we move beyond it. And that would be my call to your listeners.
Omar, thank you so much for being on Let's Just
Thank
Talk.
you.
It was a pleasure speaking with you.